Hi, I'm Ruff, and this is my guide to Civ 5. If you're brand new to Civ 5, there is some assumed prior knowledge in this guide, so that I'd recommend that you just jump into a game, play on settler difficulty, and let the in-game advisors take you through the first 100 to 150 turns. Once you've done that, you can come back here and we're going to go through a more detailed analysis of all the resources in the game and their importance from most to least important. We'll also break out each resource and I'll explain why I've given it the importance level that I have. Now that said, there are some relative things to consider in that order of importance. So what I mean by that is that these are the rules that you can use to apply to your decision-making process in general. So in general, resource X is going to be better than resource Y. But if you have a city and expand, for example, that is very short on one resource, it may be worth prioritizing that resource more than you otherwise would normally. Also, I just want to get into opportunity costs before we start the list. So opportunity cost, for anyone who doesn't know, is what you lose by doing something else. So for example, if we're building Parthenon, a world wonder, and because we're building Parthenon we can't build a workshop, that workshop is our opportunity cost. Now in that example, the opportunity cost is quite high. A workshop's a very important building, and Parthenon's quite a weak wonder. So in that example, the opportunity cost may not be worth it, and we may have made a suboptimal decision. On the other hand, if we were building a very important wonder, like Temple of Artemis, for example, which is a game-changing wonder, it's extremely strong, maybe we can justify delaying our workshop for that world wonder. So that's opportunity cost, and that's important because in Civ 5, essentially nothing is bad. If we could, we'd take everything. We'd take Parthenon, we'd take Great Merchants. There's very little that is actively bad. It's only bad because it's relative to something else that is better. I also want to talk about diminishing returns. So there are some resources that have a linear return, as in the more you get, the better it is for you. Some even have an exponential return. So it gets to the point where having a massive amount of it is not only twice as good as having half the amount, but it may be 4 times as good or 8 times as good. And then there are resources that really have no benefit beyond a certain point. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk about that as we go through the guide. I'll get my editor, that's me. My editor's terrible, so he's going to hate me now recording this, but anyway, to put up the list of each of the items on the screen as we go. So first off, the most important resource in Civ 5 is time. And what I mean by that is that games on quick speed typically last between 160 and 180 turns. So if you're optimizing your empire to peak at turn 200, then that's wasted potential. So at that point, you've probably already won or lost the game, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So whenever you're making your decisions, you really want to consider, is this going to help me reach my end goal? Knowing that your end goal is going to be, I think this is a really good game, I think it's going to end around turn 160, or oh, this is an average game, I think it's going to be around turn 180. Maybe it's a slow game and it's like, oh, I think I can stretch this game out to turn 200 or so. So it's really important to consider that. You want your empire to peak right around the time that you start your research labs, and typically that's going to be between turn 130 and turn 150. The next most important resource is information. And information is critical because this game is about decision making, and we can't make good decisions without good information. So it's been widely regarded for a long time that the optimal opening build order is Scout. And that's because information is king. So don't neglect your scouting. You need to understand where your relative position in the map is to other players, to city-states, to coastlines. It's really, really important. Also, there are some direct benefits to scouting. You receive a tech discount if you meet a player that has already received a tech that you have not. You also meet players and can trade for them with luxuries, which gives you happiness, which is also a very important resource and is not far down on the list. The next resource is space. Space is critical. You need a certain amount of space within your games to win. Typically, you can't win without at least 3 cities, and often you can't win without 4 cities. So if you prioritize building world wonders over placing expands towards your opponents, what will happen is those opponents will take those expands away from you, and then the end result is you'll have a couple of world wonders, but you won't have any space, and you simply can't win when you have that much space taken away from you. So that is the third most important resource. The fourth most important resource is military score. So if we looked at this example here, we can see that our military score is currently the lowest on the demographic screen. Now this is quite normal for a deity game, and there's not a lot we can do about this in the very, very early game, but we typically don't want to be showing last in military. It makes us very vulnerable, and it also gives other players in the game ideas about how easy it might be to kill us, and their opportunity cost for killing us, which becomes quite low. So you want as much military as you need to do what you need to do in the game. And what do you need to do? Well, first of all, you need to control barbarians and control barbarian camps. You also need to protect your workers and settlers, not only from barbarians, but also from other players. Like I said, you really want to try and stay off 6 military score if you can help it. And then you want to not die. So if you've got a neighbor that's got a lot of military, you need to take that into consideration. And again, we can see here that China is approximately triple our military. China's also quite close to us. So this is something that we should be concerned about. And we're going to need to bump up our military score because of this relationship. Something else you want to consider is how much gold that opponent have. The opponent can convert that gold into military by upgrading units. So we also want to take that into consideration when we're looking at their military score. The next most important resource is happiness. Happiness is one of 2 limiting resources in the game. And what I mean by limiting resources is that if we can't maintain a certain amount of this resource, it will have a negative impact on our game. So for happiness, if we can't maintain our happiness, we can't grow. We'll receive a 75% negative modifier to our food. We'll also receive a 2% negative modifier to our production for each point we're under 0. And overall, it's just bad. We don't want to ever be unhappy if we can help it. So this is essentially the highest direct resource priority within the game. So what that means is that you're in the early game, when you're expanding and you're short on happiness, you're really going to want to prioritize improving your luxuries. You really want to prioritize meeting other players and trading for luxuries. And you just want to stay at least 0 happiness. And I often like to try and stay at 4 happiness, so that if a trade deal with another player ends and you lose that happiness, it doesn't take you into negative territory. The next most important resource is food. The more food you have, the more of everything you have. As your cities grow bigger, you get more science, you're able to work more tiles, which give you production. Your road connections get better, giving you more gold. The entire basis of civilization is really around food and growth. It's the core fundamental building block of everything that you do. There are some exceptions to this. In the very early game, you typically don't want to grow beyond population of 3, as it's typically not worth growing to a population of 4 to generate settlers. In very rare cases, perhaps when you get a pop ruin, or you've got multiple 3 food tiles to work, it can be worth it. But otherwise, you just want to go to pop 3 and then work 3 hills ideally. Also in the early game, hammers equal food, because in the early game you're spending your hammers on things that generate food directly. So this is things like granaries, trade caravans or cargo ships, aqueducts if you're not tradition. And so in that sense, when you prioritize hammers or you prioritize a high yield tile that is perhaps a mix of food and hammers, you're still prioritizing food, because ultimately your production is food in the very early game. The next most important resource in the game is production or hammers. Production is what enables you to build everything else. So the more production they have, the more of everything else you have, and the quicker you get it. You'll often see guides like this that prioritize science more highly than production, but this is a mistake, because if you prioritize science before production, long term what ends up happening is that your science buildings actually end up being even slower, because you don't have enough production to keep up with your science. So that's another really good point, is that your production is relative to your science. So if you're having a very low science game, for example, you'll actually run out of buildings to build, because you'll finish all of your buildings and your tech won't have reached the next building that you'd want to build. So that's another good example of relative decision making that I was talking about in the introduction of the video. But in general, you want to prioritize production over everything except the points we've already gone over. The next point is great scientist points. And I say great scientist points specifically as I want to separate it from science. You get great scientist points by working specialists on science buildings, which is your universities, your public schools, and your research labs. Great scientist points are critical because they generate great scientists, and great scientists are one of the best resources within the game. Relative to science, which is the raw science yield of science per turn on the universities, the public schools, and the research labs, the scientists are much more important. So we want to get to our universities as soon as possible, and we want to start working those university specialist slots as soon as possible. It's also a reason for certain wonders in the game to be better than they otherwise would be, because they have great scientist points on them. Those notably being Great Library and Oracle. But don't turn into a Great Library rusher on me, okay? OCC Great Library is often not good. You should have a specific reason for building Great Library and a specific reason why you want that tech. Yes, that reason can be because you want to tech into Oracle and receive the double Great Scientist point. But remember the rule about space. Space for your expands is more important than world wonders. The next most important yield is science. So once you've got past working the scientist slots for the great point generation, you can then consider working particularly jungle tiles with trading posts on them. They have quite reasonable yield that gives you science directly. There are several natural wonders in the game that give you science. Most of them are quite bad, and they're very difficult to work until your cities are a very high population, like 20 population or more. The exception to that is the couple that also come with food. Food being one of the highest priority resources in the game makes that science much more tangible and easy to work. The next most important resource is culture. And culture is really important because you spend culture on social policies, and typically you spend those social policies on things that give you production, food, and science, which were earlier in the list, so more important. So specifically in the early game, you want a lot of culture because it will enable you to finish tradition as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of really good policies within tradition. If we just look at them briefly here, the most important one is the tradition finisher, which gives you 15% growth and free aqueducts. That's a significant amount of food, and it's also a significant amount of free production on the aqueducts. Similarly, Landed Elite gives you a lot of food. Monarchy gives you a lot of happiness, which is one of your limiting resources. And Aristocracy also gives you a decent amount of happiness, and it's significant. So You want, in the early game, you want to finish tradition as quickly as you can. But then in the mid game, culture actually drops off a bit. And the reason for this is because the way the cultural policies typically time out is that you'll finish tradition around turn 70 or so, and then you'll want to spend as much of your culture from that point directly into rationalism. But it's pretty rare that you can do that without spending at least one policy in the filler policies. And if you spend more than one or two policies on the filler policies, it will really slow down your rationalism timing. And this is really bad. So in the mid game, culture actually drops off quite a lot. And you want to be really careful, because if you have a high culture game early and then a slow culture game late, your rationalism timing will be terrible and you'll really notice the effect. If you're in a game where you're generating a really, really large amount of culture, so maybe you're Siam and you've got multiple cultural city-state allies, this becomes less relevant because you can actually get to a point where that you can finish whichever filler policy tree or take the good policies out of that tree, and then move on to rationalism and still finish it in a good time. So there are exceptions to that rule, but in general, you want to be careful with your culture in the mid game. Once you get into the Renaissance, which is usually around turn 100, you want to open rationalism as soon as possible, and then you want to fill out rationalism, or at least the first three policies, being secularism, humanism, and free thought, as soon as possible as well. These policies, particularly secularism, are a very, very large amount of science, and they're very important that you get these as soon as you can. So that's culture. And then the next resource is great artist points. So you get great artist points by working your guilds for your great artist, which is here. So your artist guild gives you 2 specialist slots that you can work for culture and for great artists. And again, we just talked about how important that culture is. So we're already getting culture on our guilds. And then as an added benefit, we also get great artists. And what do great artists give us? They give us more culture, and they also give us production. So you can see, again, they're contributing to things that are higher up on the list of priorities for the resources. The next resource, and it almost goes in the same bucket, is great writer points. So we get great writer points on our Writers Guild, and it works in much the same way. We're going to want to work our Writers Guild for the culture anyway, and then as an added bonus, we'll get great writer points, and those great writers will give us even more culture. And then we can spend that culture on, like I said, policies. Probably not in tradition. You're probably not generating those sorts of great people before you finish tradition. But really, you're going to be spending them on rationalism, and then later in the game again, you'll also be spending them on ideology, which is also a very important source of where you can spend your culture. After culture, great artist, and great writer points, the next most important thing is faith. So faith comes in one of 2 forms. The first form, which is the less important one, will be for investing in a pantheon where you don't want to use that pantheon to invest in a religion. So what I mean by that is that there are often starts within the game where you can't generate a lot of faith because you don't have a good faith pantheon, and instead what you want to do is invest in a very strong early game pantheon. Examples of this include Sun God is probably the best one. If you've got 4+ banana tiles, or if you've got citrus as your regional, this is a very strong pantheon and can give you a very explosive early game. Similarly, food from camps can be quite good, although it tends to be a bit slower because you actually have to build the camps, whereas Sun God, you get the bonus immediately. Production from fishing boats can also be good. It is a very high investment on your production to build the fishing boats. But there's some examples of short-term pantheons, because you don't have a long-term pantheon that generates faith that you can go for in the early game. And again, notice the ones that are the best are the ones that are highest resources on the list, are food and then production. So let's say that you have got a good faith pantheon. In this example here, we might take Earth Mother, which has got faith from iron and also from copper. Desert faith is also a very strong faith pantheon. If you've got a large section of desert tiles that you can settle cities on and work tiles on. But let's say that we have got faith from whatever source it is. That faith is then used for investing in a religion. And what does a religion give us? It gives us two things primarily. The first one is happiness. Again, our limiting resource. So it shows the importance of that religion. And the second thing primarily it gives us is gold. Now, we haven't talked about gold yet, but gold is the other limiting resource, and it's actually the next resource on the list. So we'll talk about gold now. Gold's critical because if you don't have a positive balance of gold, so if you've got no gold in the bank and your gold per turn is negative, you will directly lose science. And this is obviously very bad because science is one of the most important yields. So you need a certain amount of gold just to function within the game. You can actually get to the point where you'll make no science per turn. That's obviously very bad. So there's that sort of base threshold of gold that you need. And then the payback on gold beyond that is really relative to what you want to do with that gold. So in a peaceful game where you're not planning on going to war, the biggest expense that you're going to have for your gold is buying tiles. And why do you buy tiles? Because tiles that you buy are going to have better yield, whether it's production because it's iron, or luxuries for happiness that also have gold that reinvests and pays itself back. So you're going to spend that gold on a resource that's higher up on the list again. If you're not buying tiles and you're saving a lot of gold, you can then potentially look at buying buildings, potentially with the order cheaper building policy. And you can spend that gold on things like factories or public schools or research labs. And again, you can see that you're spending that gold, you're converting it into a resource that's higher on the list. If you're in a game that's not peaceful, quite possibly like this one, with China being quite close to us, then you're going to want to spend that gold on military unit upgrades. So that becomes relative to how much production you have and how many units from the prior era you can build before you receive the tech for the new era unit, so that you can then upgrade all of those units into that modern unit and then go and attack someone or potentially defend someone attacking you as well. So the classic example of that would be a crossbow timing. So if we decided that we wanted to go and kill China with crossbows, we'd build a lot of comp bows, we'd save a lot of gold, we'd tech machinery as early as possible, and then we'd upgrade all of our units into crossbows and go and attack China. So that's gold. So that's why faith is at where it is on the list, because primarily faith will give you happiness and it will give you gold. There are other things that faith and a religion can give you. So for example, there is culture, but typically culture is going to be lower down on your priority list than happiness or gold. There is food as well, but the balancing on those policies is typically quite weak. The other thing that you're going to spend faith on once you get past a religion is buying great people. And there's two strong great people that you typically want to buy, and those are great engineers and great scientists. So great engineers, you can buy these from the industrial era, or all great people you can buy from the industrial era. And typically when you're buying in the industrial era, you're going to be buying a great engineer for your ideology wonder. So that's quite important. The ideology wonders are very strong. They've all got a free social policy attached to them that is also very strong. And then the great scientists, once you've got sufficient culture to actually fill out rationalism, you unlock the ability to purchase great scientists with faith. And this is extremely strong. Scientists are the best great person in the game, and you can use those great scientists to accelerate your game winning method, whether it be domination or science, significantly. So there's a faith is one of the interesting ones in terms of its relative benefit. It does have a diminishing return. The cost of great people starts at 670 faith. The second great person is 1,000 faith, and then every great person after that is the addition of the two previous. So the third one is 1,670. So you can see that if you were to buy a great scientist and a great engineer, you would be spending around 1,300 faith. But if you were to buy two of each, you would be spending more than double that. So the second and subsequent great people, the cost goes up exponentially, and it's quite significant. So there's diminishing returns in faith because you can't realistically buy beyond your, say, third or fourth scientist and maybe one or two engineers. So once you get to a certain point, faith has a diminishing return. On the other hand, getting to that first great engineer purchase is really critical. So if you're thinking about 670 faith, and you're talking about maybe we have at most, say, 100 turns to generate that faith, but it's probably less because you're also going to spend faith on your great profits for your religion. But if you were talking about 100 turns, you'd want 6 to 7 faith. More realistically, it's probably half of that. It's probably more like 50 turns. So you'd obviously want double that. So somewhere around 14 faith per turn. That's probably enough to just get you one engineer, which is really the minimum that you want to get out of your faith in the late game. We already covered off gold, which is the next point on the list. So we'll move on from there. The next point is great engineering people points. So you can get these by working slots on your workshops and also on your factories and windmills if you can build a windmill in a city. So in a game, you'll often generate 1 to maybe 2 great engineers at the cost of some great scientists because they are on the same timer, and when you generate a great engineer, it does increase the cost of your great scientists as well. But there are some wonders early in the game that are so good that you can justify delaying your scientists. Notably, the most important one is Leaning Tower. And Leaning Tower gives you a free great person, and it is genuinely free. So it does pay back with that scientist right there and then you get the modifier for all of your great people. So at that point, it very much becomes worth the investment of generating one great engineer. More situationally, there are some other wonders in the game, early game, that are worthwhile generating an engineer for. Or if you simply can't generate enough faith to generate an engineer for your ideology, is sometimes worth it by working your specialist slots. And then in the very, very late game, once you've essentially got all of the technology that you need, so if you're winning via domination, for example, and you already have stealth and you already have XCOM, the great scientists, their relative benefit drops off dramatically. They essentially have no benefit at all. So you can stop trying to generate great scientists at that point and generate nothing but great engineers. And if nothing else, you can plant those great engineers and they can generate you production, which at this point in the game is extremely valuable. The next most important resource in the game is strategic resources. On strategic balance, you're guaranteed horses and iron, and also oil, but you're not guaranteed coal, you're not guaranteed aluminium or aluminum, and you're not guaranteed uranium. This is so low down on the list despite being so important because there's very little you can do to influence this. You can settle towards areas where coal and oil and aluminum are more likely to spawn. That includes tundra and desert. But obviously tundra and desert are typically bad for cities. So it's not often that you can deliberately settle towards areas expecting to get those resources, and it's still not guaranteed, even if you do. Other things you can do is, for example, if you're great generaling a city-state's luxury, make sure you general as many tiles as possible, because the strategic resources will also spawn in a certain number of city-states. So if there's, for example, with this city-state here, if we wanted the silk and we had a city settled here, we could general on this tile to receive the silk, or we could general on the silk itself so that we also pick up this hill, because there's a higher than average chance that this hill has coal or aluminum. So that's something else we can do. It's a small thing, but in the games where it makes a difference, it will be really impactful. The other thing that we can do is potentially save gold for purchasing a city-state ally, so that we can gain access to a resource that they have. So you notice here that's one of the few times that I've said that we're gonna save a resource that's higher on the list for a resource that's lower on the list. But that's just because it's such a impactful thing to not have coal in your game, but it's also a thing that you have such little control over, and it's very difficult to be able to afford at least usually 1,000 gold to be able to buy gold off a city-state. The next resource is votes within the World Congress. And I'm going to talk about the votes within the World Congress within a vacuum. So each city-state that you're allied with gives you 2 votes. And if we talked about those 2 votes completely separate from the benefits that those city-states give you, their relevance and importance is very relative. So if you're in a hostile lobby where you've got players that are proposing World Congress votes that directly negatively affect you, so they're banning your luxuries, they're proposing ideologies that are not your own, they're proposing religions that are not your own, or you're Germany and they're banning trading with city-states, or you're going on an autocracy purchasing strategy and they're banning trading with city-states, those votes can be very valuable, because if they're the votes that make the difference between something passing and something failing, then obviously they're highly beneficial. If the votes make no difference at all, because you have 2 votes and 2 more votes is only 4 and everyone else has got 6 to 8 or more, it's not going to make a difference, and they're completely non-impactful. So the importance of city-state votes within a vacuum is very relative, and there's not a good way to categorize that for you. So you're really just going to have to think about your game plan and how important the World Congress is to what you're trying to do, and whether the balance of the lobby is also trying to use the World Congress against you. Just on that point briefly, I'll just talk through the city-state benefits and their relative benefit to you in the game, because they're one of the few areas where the rules that I've laid out don't apply. So there's 5 types of city-states in the game. And the most beneficial is actually culture. There's so much culture on a cultural city-state ally that it actually exceeds the benefit of a food city-state, which is the next one on the list. So the amount of food that you get off a food city-state is relatively low, and the amount of culture you get is quite high. So in that context, you would rather take the 2x culture over the 1x food. So maybe if you were comparing 2 or 3 food allies versus 1 cultural ally, the favor would tip back the other way, but you're not. You're talking about 1 to 1. So you've got culture, you've got food, happiness. Happiness is going to be very important if you need the happiness, and almost irrelevant if you don't. Often happiness city-states are an excess amount of happiness, unless you've gone to war and you've picked up someone else's lands. Maybe you're a little bit short on luxuries, or you've missed out on any of the happiness wonders. At that point, happiness is going to be even more important than food or culture. But typically you're not going to need that much happiness. It's a lot of happiness. It's 10 happiness, which is an awful lot. Next is religious. So faith from religious city-states is going to be critical if it's a way for you to get a religion when you otherwise wouldn't get a religion. And then for saving for great people, it's going to be significant, but not game-breakingly good. So again, your mileage will vary with faith city-states. And then lastly, military city-states. You can't really rely on military city-states to gift you units and to give you the right type of units when you're on defense. They can give you catapults, they can give you nothing at all for extended periods of time. So you can't really rely on them a lot. On offense, the bonus units are quite beneficial, particularly if you can pick up like 2 military allies or 2 or 3, or maybe 1 ally and a couple of friends. At that point, even if they gift you bad units, the difference is quite impactful. But otherwise, they can't really be relied on. The next resource is Great General and Great Admiral points. You generate these directly through war. As your units gain experience, they'll also generate Great General and Great Admiral points. There's very few ways to generate these points directly in the game, so they're not too relevant to this guide. The one obvious way that you can generate more Great General points is via the Honor Policy Warrior Code, which will give you 50% faster Great Generals. This is quite a strong policy, but it's also very limited in its scope. So obviously, this is only going to be important in a game where you want a lot of Great Generals, which means that you're going to war, and most likely you're looking to end the game at or before artillery. After artillery, the usefulness of Great Generals drops off a lot. They're not going to help you out once you get to an oil or a post-oil war. So their usefulness is fairly short term. At peace, generals do have a benefit of being able to general either strategic resources or luxuries. So generating at least 1 general while you're at war with a player in the early game, be it ancient, classical or medieval, can be quite good, because you can then, after the war, having not used it on a citadel, go and general a luxury away from a city-state or that's outside of your borders, just to help with the happiness cost of taking over a new empire. The next resource is tourism. So tourism is typically quite bad. The only real benefit of tourism is counter-tourism. So if you're in a game where someone has chosen autocracy and they've chosen the futurism policy and they're generating a lot of ideology pressure towards you as either a freedom or order player, there is a mechanic within the game of counter-tourism. And essentially what that means is, if they've generated enough tourism to have you at an ideology pressure of level 2, and you've generated enough tourism to have them at an ideology pressure level of 1, the ideology pressure that you receive will be the balance, so 1 in this case. The most notable example of that is probably going to be on Eiffel Tower, the 12 tourism per turn. Particularly if you've popped a couple of great musicians into great musician works, or maybe you picked up Parthenon, that can often be enough to give you the lowest level of ideology pressure. But unless you're an autocracy player and you're generating futurism, you're not going to be generating a lot of tourism in your games typically. So the next resource is great musicians. So unlike great writers and great artists that we discussed earlier, great musicians are typically quite bad. At best, they're really going to give you 2 culture and 2 tourism per turn, and it's not very impactful. You will sometimes work your great musician guilds, but that's primarily be for the culture and not for the great musician itself. And then the last resource in the game is great merchant points. And great merchant points may be one of the worst resources in the games, and in some instances it can often be a negative impact to your game. And that's because great musicians share the same cooldown timer with great scientists and great engineers. So as you generate a great merchant, it's going to increase the cost of your next great engineer and your next great scientist. And while you can justify generating a great engineer, sometimes it's very hard to justify generating a great merchant. The opportunity cost of generating great scientists is just too high typically. One argument that you can make in some specific cases is where you can spend that merchant on influence with a cultural city-state, and you can also use the gold that it generates in an impactful way. The most common way I've seen that done is frigates. Frigates can be very gold-intensive timing attacks. So you can make an argument there, but often if you just generated a great scientist and bulbed into frigates and gotten there earlier, you'd get the same benefit and you'd have a science benefit as well. So they're typically quite bad. And guys, that wraps up the list. So thank you all for those that made it through to the end. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my content. If you enjoyed my content, come over to twitch.tv/RuffMercies. We can hang out live there on stream. We have a great time. It's a lot of awesome fun. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments below. I'm going to answer every Civ 5 strategy related question in the comments. So if I've left anything out, I've left anything that's not clear, or you'd like a more detailed explanation on a point, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you.